See pictures of female mugshots when they were arrested and their crimes. 1. Alice Adeline Cook was convicted of bigamy and theft. She was described by police as rather good-looking. 2. Alice Clark in 1916. Convicted of selling liquor without a license. She was an entrepreneur who took advantage of restrictive liquor regulations, which forced pubs to close at 6 p.m. As a sly grogger, she sold high-priced alcohol from a private residence. 3. Amy Lee in 1930. She was described in court as a good-looking girl until she fell victim to the foul practice of snorting cocaine. Her dry, blotchy skin is testament to the evils of addiction. Aged 41. 4. Annie Gunderson in 1922. Charged with stealing a fur coat from a Sydney department store. Police records do not indicate whether the fur she is wearing is the stolen item. Aged 19. 5. Doris Winifred Poole in 1924. She appeared before the Newtown Police Court charged with stealing jewelry and clothing. She had previously been convicted on a similar charge, in 1903. 6. Dorothy Mort in 1921. Convicted of murder. She was having an affair with dashing young Dr. Claude Tozer. He visited her home with the intention of breaking off the relationship. Mort shot him dead before attempting to commit suicide. Aged 32. 7. Edith Florence Ashton in 1929. She was a backyard abortionist who also dabbled in theft and fencing stolen goods. She was suspected of contributing to the deaths of at least 2 women. 8. Elizabeth Ruddy in 1915. She was a career criminal who was convicted of stealing from the house of one. She was sentenced to 12 months with hard labor. 9. Elizabeth Singleton in 1927. She had multiple convictions for soliciting and was described in police records as a common prostitute. She was imprisoned at Long Bay, but the details of her sentence have been lost. 10. Emily Gertrude Hemsworth in 1925. She killed her 3-week-old son but could not remember any details of the murder. She was found not guilty due to insanity. Hemsworth was to be detained in custody until judged fit to return to society. It is unknown if she was ever released. Age 24. 11. Esther Eggers in 1919. Her crime was malicious injury to property and wounding with intent to do grievous bodily harm. When a police officer arrived to arrest Esther for malicious damage, she attacked him, causing serious injury. She was sentenced to 12 months prison. 12. Etty Sultana in 1922. She had multiple convictions for prostitution, theft, drunkenness, swearing and vagrancy. She was sentenced to 6 months with hard labor. 13. Eugenia Fellini in 1928. Convicted of murder. Eugenia Fellini spent most of her life masquerading as a man. In 1913, Fellini married a widow, Annie Burkitt, whom she later murdered. The case whipped the public into a frenzy as they clamored for details of the man-woman murderer. 14. Evelyn Courtney in 1920. She stole a remarkable array of items, ranging from an umbrella to Irish linen napkins. She was a suspect in at least 7 different robberies during 1920. 15. Janet Wright in 1922. Convicted of using an instrument to procure a miscarriage. Janet Wright was a former nurse who performed illegal abortions from her house. One of her teenage patients almost died after a procedure, and Wright was prosecuted and sentenced to 12 months hard labor. 16. Jesse Longford in 1926. Legendary undercover policeman Constable C.J. Chuck was responsible for the arrest of Jesse Longford, a well-known shoplifter. Aged 30. 17. Kathleen Ward in 1925. She had convictions for drunkenness, indecent language and theft. She obviously enjoyed thumbing her nose at the authorities, as can be seen in this image where she appears to have deliberately fluttered her eyes in order to ruin the long exposure photograph. 18. Leslie Selina Gertrude Reese in 1915. Leslie was convicted of bigamy and was sentenced to 4 months light labor. 19. Lillian Sproul in 1928. SHR became involved in Sydney's cocaine trade. She was labelled a parasite in skirts by the newspapers and had multiple convictions relating to drug dealing. She was sentenced to 6 months in prison. 20. Mary Rubina Brownlee in 1923. Convicted of unlawfully using an instrument to procure a miscarriage. She was a backyard abortionist who was caught during an extensive police investigation. Sentenced to 12 months light labor, but her male accomplice was acquitted. 21. Matilda Devine in 1925. She used a razor to slash a man's face in a barber's shop and was sentenced to 2 years jail. She was Sydney's best-known brothel madam, and her public quarrels with Slygrog Queen Kate Lee provided the media with an abundance of material. 22. May Ethel Foster in 1928. She worked with a male accomplice to break into numerous houses and steal the contents. She had previous convictions for vagrancy, failing to appear in court and receiving stolen goods. She was sentenced to 6 months with hard labor. 23. May Smith in 1929. She was an infamous drug dealer. She once chased policewomen with a red-hot iron to avoid arrest. Smith was sentenced to 10 months with hard labor. 24. Mildred Cross in 1919. She married her first husband in 1914. After the marriage broke down, she neglected to go through the difficult and expensive divorce process. Upon marrying her second husband in 1918, she was convicted of bigamy and sentenced to 6 months with light labor. 25. Myrtle Lee in 1927. She, described in the media as a well-dressed woman, stabbed Mary Moon twice at the residence of a Chinese man. The press emphasized the racial nature of the attack with a headline white and yellow. Lee was sentenced to 6 months jail. 26. Nellie Cameron in 1930. She was one of Sydney's best-known, and most desired, prostitutes. The policewoman said Cameron had an assured poise that set her apart from all the other women of the Australian underworld. 27. Patsy Neal in 1930. Charged with theft and possession of cocaine. She was involved in various criminal activities including theft and selling cocaine. In 1932 she had a disagreement over money with the infamous Slygrogger Kate Lee, which led to Neal being threatened with a gun. 28. Pearl McFadden in 1928. She may have been supporting herself by working as a prostitute. McFadden was sentenced to 6 months with hard labor. 29. Philomena Mary Best in 1927. She stole silk and other goods valued at over £36. She was convicted and sentenced to 12 months with light labor. She stole silk and other items from her employer. 30. Phyllis Carmier in 1921. She stabbed her bludger to death during a violent altercation in a Slygrog shop. Carmier attracted much sympathy in the media, who labeled her crime a justifiable homicide. 31. Ruby Furlong in 1920. She was involved in an altercation with a drunk musician. She pulled out a razor and slashed his face, leaving an ugly scar. Furlong was a feared criminal who had a string of convictions in the early 1920s. 32. Ruth Carruthers in 1926. Convicted of false pretenses. She went on a criminal spree using the art of persuasion to obtain goods and money from hapless shopkeepers. She was eventually convicted on 4 charges of false pretenses and sentenced to 6 months. 33. Ruth Young in 1923. She had a problem with alcohol and was often homeless. She had multiple convictions for drunkenness, vagrancy and petty theft. Her head was probably shaved upon her entry to prison to eradicate head lice. 34. Marjorie Day alias Elma Walton in 1925. She convinced a shopkeeper to let her take 2 dresses home to show her mother. She promised to return promptly but instead sold the clothes at a second-hand clothing shop. A repeat offender, Day was sentenced to 6 months prison. 35. Muriel Goldsmith in 1915. Convicted of stealing. She was a prolific thief with a string of aliases. She was found guilty of stealing money and jewelry from the Criterion Hotel in New South Wales.